The Civil War, as it was fought, and then it was won because of the inclusion of 200,000 black men and women, was America's first democratic revolution. But the folks who the powers that be says, after the Civil War ended, we can't say that black people saved the Union. If we do that, then we'll have to make sure that all the rights of a democracy are bestowed upon them. We can't say that their bravery and their courage kicked me's butt, restored the Union. We can't say anything like that because we have in mind of putting them back into elements of slavery.
Welcome back to Black Stories, where we go beyond the pages of textbooks and into the hearts and voices of those who lived the history. Too often, we think we know the black history in America because we've read it. But what we've read has been selected, has been censored and sanitized to fit the shelf, not always to tell the truth. But what if you could hear the truth firsthand from someone who marched, who fought, who planted the seeds of justice, and who continues to grow a movement today? Today, I have the deep honor of sitting with Elder Jim Embry, a civil rights icon, an environmental justice warrior, an educator, and a living library of black struggles, resistance, and resilience. From marching at just 14 years old to attending Dr. King's funeral and also participating as a funeral marshal in 1968, to redefining sustainability through the lens of justice and food sovereignty, Elder Embry has lived the very history that many of us only read about. As African immigrants and as black people from the Caribbean or Europe, many of us arrive in America thinking that we know the story. But today, we'll hear what was never taught in our schools or printed in our libraries. Because as the saying goes, until the lion tells his side of the story, the hunter will always be glorified. This is Black Stories, and today the lion speaks.
Dr. G. Real stories, real people, unpacking the struggles, reclaiming the narratives with Dr. G.
Elder Embry, you have been on the front line of justice since you were a teenager. And today we're here celebrating wisdom itself. What does Juneteenth personally mean to you? And how do you believe we should carry the spirit of Juneteenth into today's struggles?
Absolutely. Well, thank you, first of all, for this invitation to be interviewed, to share my life story. And, I am here because of those who came before me, who come before me, the ancestors that go back generations. And I would think about Juneteenth and lift it up using the Sankofa bird symbol, which to me means past, present, and future. And that Juneteenth ought to give us a sense of the past. And it's generally regarded as Emancipation Day, or recognition of 3 centuries plus of enslavement of African peoples. And then presently, we have Juneteenth being recognized as a federal holiday, state holiday, and all kinds of events going on in celebration of Juneteenth. That's the present. But what's missing?
Let me introduce you to the sponsor of today's video. What happens to a people when their stories are stolen, their names rewritten, and their roots scattered across oceans? What does it mean to be black and not belong anywhere? Fractured Identities, the war on blackness and belonging, is more than a book. It's a reckoning with truth, migration, race, and what it means to belong, to be accepted. Written with raw power by Dr. John Embry, Fractured Identities speaks to those who have ever felt erased or misnamed. Ta-dang! The sponsor is me, and I want to introduce you to my book called Fractured Identities, the war on blackness and belonging. Now, if you're a black person living in the United States, in Africa, in the Caribbean, in Latin America, make sure you get a copy of this book, because this book unpacks our origin, our history, our stories, and it takes us back home to where we belong. It takes us back to who we have always been. This book will be used at some point in this segment, so please grab your copy, because this is a journey together. You can find this book on Amazon, and I'll drop the link in the description. Written by yours truly, Dr. John Embry.
As I go around the country and as I reflect on my own writings and speaking about Juneteenth, what's missing is that future. Like, what has the Juneteenth experience and how we celebrate it now, how does it give us some guiding points for the future? And we're missing that aspect of that Sankofa bird.
Some specific set of people sold the idea that there's only one way of knowing. And every other way is not valid. It's not categorized. It's not certified. So if you don't go through the universities, you are not considered as knowledgeable. And I think we need to really dismantle those kind of systems, because they took so much away from our ancestors.
Yes. And what you're doing here, I call it a form of resistance, because the Academy says knowledge comes from the library, through books, written mostly about white men, but knowledge comes from books on the campus. It doesn't come from community. It doesn't come from oral histories. It doesn't come from elders. And knowledge comes from those experts. Well, your elders can barely read or write. Your elders don't have advanced degrees. They've written nothing. Okay? They haven't been to any conference as a speaker. So that's why it is an act of revolution to say there is knowledge in our community. It's really important knowledge. There is history. There is a sensibility. There is a cosmos that we have to capture, we have to video, we have to write about and lift it up.
This is real history in the voices of those who lived it.
I would offer one minor correction about my involvement in the civil rights struggle, human rights struggle as a teenager. You're being rather generous, if you will. I began more so as a 10-year-old because my mother was the president of what was called CORE, which was a direct action civil rights organization standing for the Congress of Racial Equality. My mother was the president, and she had the presence of mind to say, well, not only should my father be involved, but my brother and I. My brother was 13, I was 10, and then we were listed in the CORE files as being members. And so we were part of the CORE training that went on before we did demonstrations, protests, picketing, sit-ins, wait-ins. We would gather in these rooms provided to us, and we would practice what it meant to be in a protest or be in a picket. And what practice meant was some of our white cohorts or white comrades, we would be walking in the room carrying signs, and then we were being cussed out. You black nigger, we're going to kick your ass, and being spit on and being maybe even pushed. But we were knew it's important to have that practice because it happened in real time. And we would do that, and then we would talk about how it's important not to respond with resistance, not to respond violently, not to even get out of the line that you were in. Stay in the line, stay together, because they're looking for a provocation to have the police beat you down, shoot you, whatever else. And I recall being cursed out, like in practice. I recall being spit on. Anyway, so my point is that I was a 10-year-old, and I'm just real grateful that my mother had that kind of insight. But and then leading to the question of Juneteenth, but then that's how she was raised. She and her family, her mom and dad and brothers lived with her grandparents. She lived with her mother's father and mother on a farm in Richmond, Kentucky. And her grandfather, as she would tell the story, would go out from the farm to the city, usually on Saturday mornings, to maybe buy things for the farm. Buy clothing, buy shoes, or certain provisions. Even though whatever they ate, they pretty much grew on the farm. They were quite self-sufficient, and they probably ate from the farm. Let's say 90% of what they ate, they grew on the farm. All kinds of course, animals and chickens and hogs and ducks and guinea fowl, and they had, of course, cows for milking and all kind of vegetables and fruit trees. And I just ate some mulberries back here a minute ago from this beautiful garden here. And I recall being on the farm there eating mulberries and blackberries and raspberries and all manner of things like that. But my mom's grandfather, his name was Don Carlos, called him D.B. Ballou, would catch the bus on Saturdays with his granddaughter, my mother, and to ride into town. And not every Saturday, but most Saturdays, and Mom tells the story, the bus would fill up, mostly with white people, and the bus driver would tell her grandfather, says, "Now, DB, you know what you have to do. Now, you get out of your seat and give your seat to the nice white woman there." And my mom said that every time that happened, my granddad never failed. He would say, you ask her, "What did you pay to ride the bus?" And she would say, "I paid a nickel." Back then it was a nickel, in the 1930s. He said, "I paid the same amount of money and we're not moving." And then they were put off the bus. Had to walk into town the rest of the way. And that was in the 30s, about 20 years before the historic Rosa Parks sit-down in the 50s. What that means is that there wasn't just my great-grandfather who was doing that thousands of black folk were doing that throughout the South. And that Rosa Parks experience was the culmination, the accumulation of individual acts like that. But we don't tell that story. We tell the story of Rosa Parks, which tells people that you got to be real special to be a leader. If you say that thousands of people, common farmers, did that, then we can say, oh, I can be in the movement. I can be an activist like those people who were very common farmers. So Juneteenth means telling stories like that, okay, that reaffirms that we all have to be agents of change. Well, so that grandfather gave my mom the experience when she was probably 10, 11, 12 years old of being put off the bus. So my mom when she came along as the Corps president, she thought it was just normal, because she experienced it, for her sons to also experience being involved in the civil rights movement. So I'm grateful for my mom both having the experience and then having a leadership role where she could then incorporate her children in the movement. If it hadn't been for that, I probably wouldn't be here today being interviewed. Now that great-grandfather, his father was part of what was called the U.S. colored troops. He was part of the surge of mostly black men, but black women as well. Some 200,000 black men and women at the encouragement and the enlistment, if you will, executive order from President Lincoln, joined the Union Army, some 200,000. And out of Kentucky, there were about 28,000. And in my family, beyond my direct line great-grandfather, who I referred to, his brother, that great-grandfather, our direct line, was named Jackson Ballou. His brother, George Ballou, also mustered in the U.S. colored troops. And on my dad's side, we had another great-grandfather, Louis Gilbert, who also mustered in. So I'm just always so proud and always so honored to lift up their names as three great-granddads, three great-grandbabas that I'm referred to by my grandkids, who were part of that, I call it the legalized armed insurrection. Legalized armed insurrection of some 200,000 black men and women. And so, following the Juneteenth story, two of those great-grandfathers were in the 114th Regiment that mustered in. It was called Camp Nelson. Camp Nelson is now recognized as a federal park with all kinds of, of course, park rangers and histories, and this a cemetery. But it was also a army camp for the U.S. colored troops that mustered in Kentucky. So two of our great-grandfathers, which was Jackson Ballou, George Ballou, the brother of Jackson Ballou, and our in-law on my dad's side, Louis Gilbert, they were in the same regiment, 114th Regiment, which was the regiment that I say jokingly were assigned to go to Virginia, and they kicked Lee's ass. Okay? I say that laughingly, but literally, that they were part of the that army force that literally surrounded Lee. And I like to joke about how that happened. I said, well, these brothers, back in the Civil War, were the ancestral, they were the ancestors of people like Michael Jordan and other kinds of athletes, because General Lee and General Grant both went to West Point. They were friends. But General Lee was regarded as a tremendous military tactician. And during the Civil War, the reason why President Lincoln in 1863 accepted the encouragement of people like Harriet Tubman and Martin Delany and Frederick Douglass to let black folk fight, Lincoln said, no, this is a white man's war. But then what happened, General Lee, great tactician, was kicking the ass of the North. His friend Grant was losing the war, So Lincoln said, well, gee, what can we do, okay, to turn the tide? And if you're fighting any kind of a war, and you get 200,000, call them fresh troops, if you get 200,000 troops to come in, but they were fighting for their own freedom, they were fighting for the freedom of their wives, their children, fighting for the freedom of their grandmamas and grandpapas, they were fighting for the freedom of the future, those who are on the way, then you're going to fight like hell. And they did. And tying that to the idea of food and agriculture, when those men and women mustered in, I would say 80% of them, when they wrote down what their occupation was, they said farmers. So I call this the legalized armed insurrection of black farmers, and that and those soldiers saved the South. So what we're saying about the idea of Juneteenth and what it should mean is that it was black farmers that saved the Union and reunified the nation. And then, so now we're saying, because of the initial contradiction of our country, of stolen land from indigenous people, stolen labor from African people, to do what? To do agriculture and foodways. That was the initial contradiction. And it's still the contradiction. But we're saying now that food, agriculture, that intersect, farmers, black farmers, have a role now, have a role in the future of reunifying the country along the lines of peace and civility and this idea of the sense of love and respect for the earth, love and respect for the entire community of earth, the human people, the rock people, the tree people, the water people, the mountain people. These are all our relations. So Juneteenth ought to be about, that peace ought to be, how do we as humans step into that maturation as a species and begin to be not only stewards of the earth, but right now almost co-regenerators of the earth. We've caused so much extinction, and now our work is to maintain, preserve what we have, and literally try to co-regenerate this great biodiversity. So anyway, back to the idea of the military and the Civil War. So what happened, according to military records, and they're all in the records now, General Lee saw himself being surrounded, and he sent a certain portion of his soldiers, let's say, to the west, thinking that, well, the Union Army will take that as a move to escape, and they'll fall for that feint, like playing basketball. You go down, you might fake with your left hand, and then you turn around and you shoot with your right hand, like Michael Jordan sometimes does. But these black troops and the military said, he is trying to fool us. He's trying to give us the okie doke by sending some troops to the west, and he's going to try to escape to the south. But what we're going to do, we're going to do like Michael Jordan coming down to the basketball to dunk, has the ball in the left hand, a guy goes up to block him, he moves his arm around to the right hand and dunks. So that's what our folk did. Our black troops didn't fall for that move, and they went the other direction, and they were literally able to surround Lee and force his surrender. And as we know, General Grant and General Lee met at Appomattox. It really wasn't the courthouse or someone's home, but they met at Appomattox. And according to military records that we have, then our two great-grandfathers were outside of this Appomattox courthouse, awaiting the surrender and being there for the surrender. And that was in April of 1865. And then that 114th Regiment, because there were still Confederate forces in Texas that were still skirmishing and still active, then that regiment, along with 2 other regiments, about 16,000 black troops, then were put on boats there, I guess, off the coast of Virginia. Then they sailed around, of course, Florida, all the way to Galveston, and they arrived there, around May 14th, May 15th of 1865. And we give credit to General Granger, give him credit as proclaiming Juneteenth on June 19th, 1865. And I maintain that it wasn't General Granger, give him too damn much credit. It was these 16,000 black troops, 3 of whom were 2 of them who were our great grandfathers, came across the Gulf, landed on Galveston Island, and began marching off the boat, into Galveston. And when I'm speaking, I try to add a little humor. I said, well, if you were a white person in Galveston, Texas, and you saw this image of a boat arriving, thinking they're probably the Confederate Army, but it wasn't Confederate Army of white men. It was the Union Army of 16,000 black men coming off the boat. You'd have been yelling, what in the hell is going on? The world has come to an end. There's black men coming off the boat. There's a whole bunch of them. What in the hell is going on? They've been running, they've been shouting, they've been cursing. However, in that same crowd were all these enslaved Africans. And they were shouting, not what in the hell, they were shouting, hallelujah, hallelujah, praise God. Wow. And falling on their knees probably, and just praying and crying, hugging the troops, running to them with joy and jubilee, with thoughts that we've heard about this thing called emancipation. It was announced 2 years ago, and now we can see it. So, in my view, we ought to give honor of Juneteenth, not to General Granger, because generals don't fight wars. Generals come along when the fighting's been done, and they get all the glory. So Juneteenth, in my view, ought to be celebrated as this legalized armed insurrection of black farmers who were black men and women who saved the Union and then brought in what we call Juneteenth. And so for me, it's a personal story, in that I have, again, relatives, great grandbabas, and we have their military records that show all of that, and celebrate that way as Emancipation, Jubilee Day, but also Reunification Day. That for 5 years we were called a divided country. There were 2 separate countries. There was a North USA, and then there was a Confederacy, who had their own constitution, they had their own currency, they had their own flag, they had their own president. They were sending emissaries to Europe, emissaries to the Caribbean on boats. They were 2 separate countries. As a matter of fact, President Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation really had no jurisdiction in the South. It was meaningless. You can't tell another country that your folk who were enslaved are free. Okay, but we have 2 separate countries, and to me it's important to recognize that it was these black soldiers that fought for those 2 years, defeated the South, and then reunified the country. If that hadn't happened, we wouldn't be here today having an interview. We would be facing something very different. We would be like North Korea, South Korea. There would be no UN, as we know it. There would be no USA, moving from East Coast to West Coast. There would be no Alaska as part of the country, no Hawaii. The world would be entirely different if these 200,000 black men and women did not fight and reunify the country. And that should be more so than July 4th. It's that effort around Juneteenth of winning the war was the first American democratic revolution. What we call the first revolution in 1776 really wasn't a democratic revolution. It was a war to continue enslaving Africans. It was a war meant to continue taking the lands from indigenous people. That's why the war was fought. It wasn't about taxation. It wasn't about the king not wanting folks over here in USA to have representation. It was about the fear that England was about to announce, you all cannot take any more lands from indigenous people. You can't enslave any more Africans. And George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and all of those titans, all those founding fathers, always had enslaved people. And they said, wow, we want to keep enslaving people. We want to keep taking more land, so we're going to fight a war. And it wasn't a war about democracy. If it was, then women would have been given the right to vote and brought into the government. If it was a war about democracy, then white men that didn't own property would have been allowed to be a part of the government. If it was a war about democracy, then they would have freed all the enslaved Africans. But they didn't do that. So it was not a war about democracy, as we proclaim it to be. But the Civil War, as it was fought, and then it was won because of the inclusion of 200,000 black men and women, was America's first democratic revolution. But the folks who the powers that be says, after the Civil War ended, we can't say that black people saved the Union. If we do that, then we'll have to make sure that all the rights of a democracy are bestowed upon them. We can't say that their bravery and their courage kicked me's butt, restored the Union. We can't say anything like that because we have in mind of putting them back into elements of slavery through the black codes, sharecropping, Jim Crow laws, lynchings, hangings, the KKK. So that story has never been told. And we're saying now, let's change the narrative and tell this story.
This is not revision. This is restoration.
So again, Juneteenth ought to be about taking the Sankofa bird, taking this African symbolism, this African cosmology, and say, yes, let's change the narrative of the past and what happened. Let's celebrate in the present. But the celebration ought to be about reunifying the country. There ought to be a celebration of our desire to always be free. Okay? Our change the narrative to say it was our courage, it was our bravery, it was our willingness to fight for the freedom of ourselves, our wives, our children, our grandparents, and those on the way, that we should be celebrating not just red velvet cake, not just the colors of Juneteenth, not just music, not just food, not just eating barbecue and okra and having a great time. In the United States, we take holidays that have meaning and we commercialize them, make it into an event that has no sense of responsibility for the future, no sense of vision, but come out, eat, drink, hear music, have a great time like any other holiday. So black folk ought to be thinking differently about Juneteenth and what it means, and it needs to be about the future. How do we create peace, civility? How can we get guns out of our community? How can we take those guns? Some friends of ours out in Oakland, California have a program called Lead to Life. Lead meaning like the lead in bullets. And what they do in their garden space, they invite young people, young men, come and turn your guns in right here. Stack them up, your revolvers, your rifles, come and stack them up right here and find responsibility, find mission, find brotherhood, find community in the garden and rebuilding community. Then they take those guns and they melt them down. Then they make out of those melted guns shovels, rakes, hoes, garden tools. That's what they do. It's called Led to Life. So we try to create, yes, a sense of peace among human people, absolutely, but we have to get rid of the guns, okay? And our folk don't make the guns. If you go in here, we're sitting in Rondo neighborhood. I don't see any factories here that make guns. If you go to Chicago, if you go to LA, go to Washington, D.C., in the black communities, I don't see big factories making guns. They're made by other forces. We have to do things to point the finger at the real culprits. Okay? And we have a lot of work to do in terms of the idea of creating peace. We're sitting here in Rondo neighborhood. There's a big old highway that came through here years ago, disrupted the community, created, lack of community. It destabilized the community, and it created the space and environment for peace to be eroded. So I'm going to let that be the summary of this first question. I'm honored to try to respond to.
I must say it's such a wonderful background that you bring to Juneteenth, especially for folks who don't know what exactly Juneteenth is all about. And I love the fact that you mentioned how you are personally connected to this story.
You remember when he mentioned that his grandfather would be told to give up his seat for a white lady on the bus, and he refused. But even with that refusal, they were kicked off the bus. So I asked him, how do you see black people being kicked off the bus today? And what should their reaction be? Watch this next clip to get what he had to say.
Dr. G. Real stories, real people, unpacking the struggles, reclaiming the narratives with Dr. G.